Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone here, the special meeting of the Board of Estimates. As always in the Board of Estimates, we ask for our visitors to wear masks at all times. Obviously, if you're up at the mic, you do not have to wear a mask. We also ask that for all electronic devices, cell phones, tablets, computers, that you put them on silent, if not turn them off, to ensure that we do not disrupt today's proceedings. The purpose of this meeting is to receive a briefing from the Department of Finance and BBMR on the proposed budget for fiscal year 2024. Again, the BOE is meeting in hybrid fashion, so there are potentially some folks that will have to call online. In the interest of keeping the meeting on time, I'll turn it over at this time to the Department of Finance, BBMR Director, and anyone else from the Department of Finance who would like to speak on behalf of the city. At this time, the floor is yours, Madam Director.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us here today to talk with you all about the fiscal 24 preliminary budget recommendations. During today's overview, we are going to walk through some key highlights regarding the fiscal 24 preliminary budget.
Madam Director, if I could stop you real quick, if you could just ensure that you introduce yourself. Yes. The board knows you really well, but it's important for the public to know the important job that you do for the city of Baltimore.
Wonderful. Thank you for that reminder. This is my first budget that I'm presenting to you as Director of BBMR. My name is Laura Larson, City Budget Director, and again, very honored to be able to be here today to talk with you all about the fiscal 24 budget. In terms of today's presentation, we are going to begin by talking through some key highlights in the fiscal 24 budget, including what our preliminary forecast showed and some of the key strategies that were deployed to balance this year's budget. Then we'll go through the general fund revenue and break it down by major changes in some of the city's large revenue sources that fund the general fund. Then we'll take a look at the expenditures, breaking down key highlights by each of the pillars in the mayor's action plan. And then we'll wrap up by talking about some key highlights in some of the other funds like utilities and grants. So starting off in terms of the key highlights, in the Finance Department's baseline projections, we were projecting that general fund revenue was growing by about 4.6% compared to 8% growth in expenditures.
Can you go help her?
Okay, I know you're about to. Yeah, there you go. That's good.
Okay.
Good.
There we go. Okay, wonderful. Now we're in business. So again, in terms of the high level pictures of where we were starting, our baseline forecast showed revenues growing by 4.6% or $95 million compared to expenditures growing by 8% or $159 million. That growth that we're seeing on the expenditure side was primarily driven by the increased cost in the city's local share for city schools, as driven by the state funding formula established by the Department of Education. When we look at these two numbers, what that means based off of the required increase for schools, approximately 84% of the city's revenue growth in fiscal 24 will be dedicated to meeting our funding requirement for schools. The preliminary budget that was presented to the Board of Estimates is balanced and does fully resolve that $64 million gap. The budget was balanced through a series of initiatives that realize savings in expenditures across agency budgets, enhancing some various locally controlled revenue sources, and then tapping into fund balance as a one-time source for fiscal 24. So if we break down those budget balancing actions in more specifics, as I mentioned, the total gap that was balanced was $64 million. $24.6 million of that is balanced through a series of initiatives focused on agency budgets and revenue, and then $39.4 million is coming from fund balance, which is a one-time source for fiscal 24. Talking specifically about the $24.6 million of savings initiatives, the budget assumes $5 million in savings from vacant positions. This will be realized, this savings target better reflects the current level of turnover that we're seeing across the general fund for our positions across agencies. The budget also includes $10 million in targeted expenditure reductions across agency budgets. Now, this is a combination of reductions to line items that have historically been underspent in various agencies, but also includes some recalibration or updates to inflation assumptions that were built into the baseline forecast. A great example of that is our fuel estimates for the city fleet. When we did our initial forecasts in the fall, the fuel futures were much higher than what they're at right now, and so we were able to bring down fuel budgets by about $1 million lower than what our initial projections were. The preliminary budget also recommends one-time reductions to the city's rainy day and OPEB or other post-employment benefit funds. Now, again, these are funds where we make an annual contribution from the city's general fund in order to make sure that those funds grow as the city's general fund grows. So even though we're reducing our contributions to those funds in fiscal '24, we're still making contributions to those funds, just at a slightly lower rate than what we're doing in fiscal '23. Those contributions will likely have to be restored or increased again once we move past fiscal '24. On the revenue side, the budget assumes that we will realize additional revenue through the first phase of tax credit reform. Again, that will be guided by policy recommendations that will come through after the budget gets adopted. And then finally, the budget assumes additional revenue that will be realized through redeploying some of the city's inventory of traffic cameras to different locations throughout the city that better align with public safety and pedestrian outcomes. So that the number of cameras will stay the same, but the locations of them will be moved to new areas. So again, those items total $24.6 million. The remaining $39.4 million of the gap will be balanced by applying one-time fund balance that is the result of the surplus that the city ended fiscal '22 with. So even though there were significant gaps that had to be addressed as the budget was balanced, Mayor Scott's preliminary budget plan does make a number of targeted investments in different areas.
Sorry, the person you were trying to reach has a voicemail box that has not been set up yet.
Can you just go up there? The budget does make a series of investments in key areas throughout the city. The first item is in the area of fleet investment. So the city allocates funding every year as part of our master lease program in order to replace assets that comprise the city's fleet. In fiscal '24, our allocation for master lease replacements will be increasing from $26 million to $35 million, which will really do two things for the Department of General Services. It will help them to break through the logjam that we see in the supply chain when it comes to the different fleets or the different vehicles that comprise the city fleet, but it will also ensure that our purchasing power remains the same, as this is one of the areas where we've seen the greatest impact of inflation on the city's budget. There's also an investment in services for minority and women-owned businesses. In fiscal '24, those services, which are currently part of the law department, will actually move out to a standalone mayoralty-related agency. This standalone agency will be solely focused on increasing opportunities for minority and women-owned firms with city business, and also help to connect these businesses with other business opportunities throughout the city. The budget also makes investments in services for older adults. There's funding for 6 additional positions within the Senior Center Service and the Health Department in order to connect older adults with different programs that are offered through our Senior Center programming. And there's also funding to create the Independent Office of Aging by hiring an executive director who will get that office up and off the ground, along with a planning grant for that office to really build out what that program should look like. And then finally, the budget continues the investment in the city's Vacants Initiative. There's funding for 3 additional positions in the housing department in order to continue to invest in the department's NREM strategy that's focused on assembling blocks of vacant properties so that they can be redeveloped and returned to productive use for those neighborhoods. There's also funding for a position that will be focused on really understanding the population and demographic trends looking back in terms of the city's vacant housing stock, and then making projections forward to help to inform additional policy directions as we move forward. So all these numbers come together to give us our high line numbers of the $4.4 billion total budget. If you can go to the next slide. So again, the preliminary budget is $4.4 billion. On the operating side, that is $3.471 billion, or an increase of about $154.6 million. That's a 4.6% increase year over year. On the capital budget side, the fiscal 24 budget, as recommended by the Planning Commission, is just under $888 million, or an increase of $95.3 million. That's a 12% increase over fiscal 23. When we look specifically at the general fund, the preliminary recommended budget is just shy of $2.2 billion, or a $113.9 million increase. That's a 5% increase year over year. So as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the big items that had to be grappled with as we balanced the fiscal 24 budget was how to handle the increase in schools funding. So fiscal 24 represents the second year of funding allocations under the state's Blueprint for Education legislation that has been passed. The initial projections for the blueprint estimated that the city would see a significant increase in the first year, which was fiscal 23, and then in the subsequent years after that, the city would see approximately $10 to $15 million increases year over year. In fiscal 23, we saw our local share go up by about $49.5 million, and again, that was fully funded in this year's adopted budget. But what we were expecting to see in fiscal 24 was an increase of about $12 million, and what we're actually seeing is that our share is going up by about $79.4 million. Now, again, that change in the overall increase is driven by the outputs from the state's education funding formula. One thing that's important to note when it comes to the school's funding is that fiscal 24 is actually the first year in which we're using the state funding formula to establish the state and local shares for education. In fiscal 23, those amounts were just established in state law. So this is really the first year where we're seeing how the education formula interacts with the new requirements under the blueprint. So what that means is that for the city's budget is that our overall funding for city schools will be up by about $129.1 million over these 2 years. And in fiscal 24, our local share for schools will represent about 18% of the city's total general fund. So if we put those numbers in context of historical spending for schools, so again, under the maintenance of effort, funding for schools had hovered around that $200 million mark, going all the way back to fiscal 21. And that really extended to fiscal 2017. Now, in that time period, that coincides with what we began to see in terms of loss of student enrollment in city schools. And so for many of these years, the city was contributing over the maintenance of effort in order to hold the school system harmless from any changes in student population. Now, in fiscal 2018, the city began to prepare for the changes that were anticipated under Kirwan, and so we saw the Bridge to Kirwan initiatives where funding was stepped up at a slower pace annually. Then we saw fiscal 23, which was our first, as I mentioned, the first year under the blueprint, where we saw that increase of about $49 million. And then in the second year, in fiscal 24, that's where we're seeing the higher increase of $79 million. Where those two numbers put us is essentially in fiscal 24, we will be where we thought we would be in fiscal 29 under the initial analysis that accompanied the Kirwan legislation. So why did this happen, and what sort of caused that unexpected change? There are two components of the school's formula that behaved differently than what was initially assumed in those DLS projections. So there's two components of the state formula that really shifted. The first is the Education Effort Index. Now, what the Education Effort Index intends to do is look at a jurisdiction's overall tax base and compare that to how much funding they're providing to the schools. It takes that ratio and then indexes it against all of the other jurisdictions in the state of Maryland. And so previously under this program, the city received a 100% credit when it was indexed against all of those other jurisdictions. Based off of those factors in fiscal 2024, the city will be dropping from that tier where we received a 100% credit down to the lower tier where we will now only be receiving a 35% credit. Now, that component of the formula is the biggest driver of why we saw our funding for schools increase at a faster rate. The other component that is driving the change is the compensatory education component of the formula. Compensatory education is the second largest funding component of the state funding formula. And what this does is it looks at poverty levels among student populations that are served by school districts. Under the Kirwan legislation, the state changed the way that it was looking at quantifying the number of students in poverty that are served by school districts across the state. So instead of looking at free and reduced lunch enrollment, they started to use Medicaid eligibility as the proxy measure for that factor. So what happened when they did that, there were about 110 additional students statewide that were now identified as being in poverty. Those 110 students were in some of the wealthier jurisdictions in the state, as well as the rural jurisdictions in the state. There wasn't much of a change here in Baltimore City, but what that meant is that where there used to be a big gap between Baltimore City and the rest of the jurisdictions, there's now less of a gap. And so some of the funding that the city used to receive through this compensatory education factor of the formula was then reallocated to those other jurisdictions that saw larger growth in the number of students in poverty. So again, those initial projections that accompanied the Kirwan legislation assumed that these factors in the state formula would stay consistent and that there wouldn't be major shifts in demographics or tax base. But what we're seeing is that when you couple the intent of the legislation with the changing demographics of the state in general, this is how we're getting this larger than originally anticipated increase for schools. So with those numbers as context, let's start to break down the general fund budget, first by talking about revenues. So the general fund, as I mentioned, the general fund budget in the preliminary recommendations is just under $2.2 billion. Here you can see what that looks like as it breaks out across the major revenue sources that fund the general fund. Property taxes continue to make up about 50% of the city's total budget. The next largest share is income taxes, and then followed by highway user revenues. So what we'll do now is we'll walk through some of the major changes and shifts in these various revenue sources. So first we'll talk about property taxes. Property taxes are projected to be up by $29 million in fiscal '24. That equates to about a 2.8% increase overall. Again, this revenue source accounts for 48% of the city's total revenue. So when we look at what's happening within the property tax, fiscal '24 is the first year in which our property tax assessments are really seeing the full impact of what's happened in the real estate market over the last couple of years. In fiscal '24, we're capturing the reassessments that happened for Group 2, so that represents the middle portion of our city. What we saw in these reassessments is that overall they're up by about 21%, which that represents the 10th consecutive year of growth in property tax assessments. This also represents one of the largest increases that we've ever seen in Group 2. Now, one of the things to keep in mind in terms of the disconnect between the overall assessment growth and the revenue growth is that much of what we're seeing in terms of the assessment growth is happening on the residential property side. We're actually seeing commercial property assessments come down slightly. On the residential property side, those increases get phased in over multiple years through our homestead tax credit. And so the lower revenue assumption here really represents the amount of the length of time that it takes for us to really realize the increase in property tax assessment on the city's property tax. One thing to note is that the preliminary budget continues the initiative that started a number of years ago to drive down the property tax in terms of the 20 cents by 2020 initiative. And so the fiscal 24 preliminary budget maintains the tax rate and makes no adjustments in the effective rate. Talking also on the property tax front, the cost of offering tax credit programs in fiscal 24 is projected to be down by $7 million, or a 7.3% reduction. So you can see this chart is showing us sort of the cost of property tax, the cost of the total tax credits that are offered over a period of time. And so you can really see that since fiscal 20, we've kind of seen those start to ebb down slightly. And again, tax credits will be something that are looked at following adoption of the fiscal 24 budget as we start to look at various elements of reform for that program. The next revenue source is income tax. Now, this is the second largest revenue source in the city's general fund. It represents about 20% of our total budget. This continues to be an area of strength in the city's revenue. It's projected to increase by $16.7 million, or about 3.9%. So what we're seeing on the income tax side is that the city's tax base continues to grow. But when you look at it by income bracket, we're actually seeing that we have fewer filers making less than $60,000 and more filers making more than $60,000. And so with those higher filers paying a larger percentage towards income tax, that's what's really helping to drive some of the growth that we are seeing on this revenue source. It's also important to note that we continue to see unemployment trends in the city go in the right direction. In December, our unemployment rate hit 4.4%, which was the lowest that we had seen since January 2019. And that number has continued to trend down as we've moved into the spring. Next up is highway user revenue, which represents about 8.7% of the revenue based off of the preliminary budget. Highway user revenue is projected to be up by about $23.4 million, or 13.8%. Now, fiscal 24 represents the first year in which the city will be receiving a higher allocation of the highway user revenue program based off of legislation that passed in the General Assembly in 2022. That law change last year increased the city's overall allocation with the intent of trying to get the city back up to where we were with our HUR allocations pre-Great Recession. And so what that means is that we will see an increase of about 9.5% in fiscal 24. We'll see a larger increase in fiscal 25. And then in fiscal 26 and 27, our allocation will be at 12.2% and then begin to taper back down in fiscal 28, back down to 9.5%. Now, what this means is that we'll be able to make some significant investments in DOT's capital program, which that was what was really hurt when we saw those reductions about 10 years ago when the highway user revenue dropped off. One thing that is important within this revenue that we continue to closely monitor with our partners at the state is what's happening with the various inputs to HUR revenue. So obviously, if the state receives less highway user revenue, even though we're getting a higher allocation, it will be short of what we're projecting here. So 3 of the 5 components that drive the HUR allocation are actually trending slightly down in fiscal 23. That's registration fees, titling tax, and fuel tax. But we are seeing those declines be offset by the corporate income tax that is dedicated to HUR. Next up is transfer and recordation taxes. So this revenue is projected to be up $6.8 million, or 7.6%. This revenue source represents about 4.4% of the overall general fund budget. Now, transfer and recordation tax is something that the city has really benefited from as we saw the strength in the real estate market. You can see here that in fiscal 22, our revenue from transfer and recordation tax reached record high levels, again, driven by the real estate activity that we saw both through sales and then refinancing activity while interest rates were at their record lows. What we're projecting in fiscal 24 is that we will return to a more normal real estate market. And for us, that fiscal 2019 is really the last year of what we would compare, of what we would say was our last normal year. And so we are projecting we'll get back to those more normal real estate market. But the other thing that's helping us out in transfer and recordation taxes is now that our property is worth more, because these taxes are calculated based off of the value of the property, we are going to continue to see growth just based off of the higher property value. Next up are our tourism and visitor-related revenues. So this is our hotel tax and then the net parking revenues that come to the city's general fund. These revenues represent about 2% of our total general fund revenue. We're projecting they'll be up by $5.6 million or 13.4%. On the hotel side, we're actually seeing really great news in terms of demand for our hotel rooms returning back to pre-pandemic levels. We actually project that in fiscal 24, we'll get back to about 90% of where we were before COVID really saw these numbers come down to zero. The other thing that's helping us out on the hotel tax side is that the average nightly room rate to get a hotel room in Baltimore City is up if you compare that back to what hotels were charging in 2018, 2019. So the combination of higher demand plus higher prices is really what is driving the growth in this revenue. The other item that we're looking at here is the net parking revenue that comes to the city's general fund. Parking revenue is something that we saw come pretty much down to zero during COVID, and we have not seen come back in the same way that we've seen demand for hotel rooms come back. So on the parking side, we are seeing a bit of growth in terms of the revenue that we're projecting in the general fund, but that is coming from working with the parking authority to identify savings in their contractual services rather than seeing additional revenue from demand. And our last revenue to call your attention to is the traffic camera program. So this revenue source is actually declining by about $4.4 million, or down by about 14.5%. This revenue source represents about 1.2% of the city's overall general fund budget. One thing to keep in mind, this is just our speed camera and red light camera program. This does not include the cameras on I-83. Again, revenue from those cameras is restricted to just be utilized for operating that program and improvements to the I-83 roadway. Now, on traffic cameras, what we're seeing and what's shown in this chart is that the further you get away from the initial deployment of the camera, the fewer the number of the citations that are issued by the camera. So essentially, drivers get used to them and then adjust their behavior. Now, that's a good thing if that is causing folks to slow down and be more safe in these areas. And so, as I mentioned, the preliminary budget does anticipate redeploying some of these cameras, about 69 of those cameras. And the goal there is to move them to a place where they can align with pedestrian and traffic safety outcomes in order to continue to have an impact where in some of these areas drivers are really used to them, and so we're already seeing the positive impact. One of the things that is persistent with this particular item is that our collection rate is relatively low. We only collect about 50% of the citations of the revenue based off of the citations that get issued. That is really driven by a couple of factors. We're constrained by our recourse to go after folks who've not paid those citations. There's also no late fees assessed on these. Now, the program in general is heavily guided, and the policies are really spelled out in state law. So any sort of changes to help impact the collection rate would have to be something we'd have to partner with our partners in Annapolis in order to see a change on that front. So shifting gears now to talk about the expenditures. As I mentioned, the total operating budget is about $3.5 billion. When we look at that by fund, the general fund, which is that $2.2 billion that we've been talking about, it represents about 62% of the total budget in fiscal '24. The next largest share is grant funds that comprise about 20% of our budget, followed by enterprise and utility funds that represent approximately 17% of the budget. One thing to note here is that these splits between these different funds are consistent with the breakdown in the fiscal '23 budget as well. When we look at where that money's going and how it's used, we can see that the largest expenditure on the operating budget side is in personnel. That represents about just over 43% of the total operating budget, followed by contractual services that represent just under a quarter of the total operating budget. One of the things that we monitor closely within the operating budget is how our fixed costs change year over year in terms of how much fixed costs represent of the total budget. Now, the goal here is to make sure that we keep fixed costs as low as possible to ensure that we have the city and policymakers are able to maintain as much discretion as possible in terms of moving funds around within the city's operating budget. And so what we can see is that fixed costs have remained relatively steady going back to fiscal '22. But as revenue has grown, we've actually seen the fixed cost trend down slightly. Some of those trends, downward trends that we have seen, going back to fiscal '17, can really be attributed to some of the initiatives in the 10-year financial plan that was implemented in 2014, really focused on reducing some of these fixed costs. But as you can see, with the schools change in fiscal '24, that trend is starting to creep back up, which is, again, one of the reasons why we're talking about bringing the 10-year financial plan back so that we can ensure that we are keeping this ratio at the targeted level. So when we talk about where the money in the operating budget is going, as I mentioned, the operating budget is built around the pillars that are identified in the mayor's action plan. So the total general fund budget is $2.17 billion, and so you can see here what that looks like when it is spread out against the different pillars. Building public safety represents about 43% of the budget, followed by prioritizing our youth, and then equitable neighborhood development, responsible stewardship of resources, and clean and healthy communities. In terms of some major highlights within each of the pillars, on prioritizing our youth, we've talked about the increase in funding for city schools. The budget also fully funds the operating costs for the city's network of rec centers. In fiscal '24, we will reopen the Carroll Park Rec Center, and the budget does include increased costs associated with those one-time items associated with bringing that facility back online. The capital budget continues investment in renovating and upgrading the city's network of rec centers, and so we see funding for 3 additional facilities reflected over on the capital budget side. The preliminary budget also increases the wage for participants in the Youth Works program that's offered by MOED. This is also in line with the governor's action to expedite the implementation of the $15 minimum wage. Shifting now to building public safety, the preliminary budget makes an investment in victim services within the police department by adding 5 additional civilian positions to expand existing victim services beyond the current offerings, which are focused just in the southern and western districts. This increase in staffing was funded by identifying other long-term vacant positions, civilian positions within BPD that had not been filled for some time. So this was no net cost in fiscal '24. The preliminary budget also proposes creating 4 additional safety officer positions within the fire department. So these positions will be part of the fire suppression service and our direct recommendation from the Board of Inquiry report regarding the Stricker Street fire. And then finally, the budget fully funds the Police Accountability Board and the 20 positions that make up that team. The board was approved by the City Council back in June and initially funded as an amendment to the fiscal 23 budget. So fiscal 24 is the first year where we see that show up as a reoccurring appropriation in the city's budget. Shifting gears now to clean and healthy communities. The preliminary budget proposes creating up to 10 crews for solid waste to stabilize solid waste services within the Department of Public Works. The intent of these crews is to ensure that staffing levels are sufficient to avoid having to pull teams from other routine operations in order to meet the daily minimum staffing requirements for the city's trash and recycling routes. As I mentioned, the budget also makes investments in services for older adults, both by the increased funding in the health department for those senior center positions, and then again with the foundational funding for that new standalone office that will really be focused on streamlining services for this population. And then finally, in recreation and parks, the budget includes funding to create up to 19 new positions that will be focused on maintenance throughout the parks that are managed by Rec and Parks, but as well as the facilities that are part of their building inventory. These positions are being funded by an increase in state funding that is received by Rec and Parks. On the equitable neighborhood front, the budget includes funding for 3 new positions and contractual funding for an equity assessment within within the Office of Equity and Civil Rights. As I previously mentioned, there's additional funding that's been added for the Mayor's Office of Minority and Women-Owned Businesses, again with the focus of expanding that team's capacity in order to focus on increasing participation in city business and then other opportunities throughout the community. And then the budget also makes an investment in the Right to Counsel program that's offered by the Housing Department in order to help residents who are in the eviction process. So the budget includes funding to create 2 new outreach positions and then to step up outreach and communication efforts associated with that program so that residents know what type of services are available and how to access them. And then finally, for responsible stewardship of city resources, the budget includes funding to continue the CDL incentive program that was approved by the Board of Estimates in March of 2023. And so this is a $10,000 incentive program that is paid out to various classifications in the city that require a CDL. So these individuals will receive quarterly payments over eight quarters through the program. And so the bulk of the program will take place in fiscal 24, and as intended as envisioned, will continue into fiscal 25. As I also previously mentioned, the budget includes increasing funding to replace our fleet assets. The Department of General Services estimates that this increase from $26 to $35 million will increase their purchasing power by about 28.5%, which will be good news in terms of some of the critical fleet assets that have been a struggle to get on site based off of supply chain issues. And then finally, there's funding to create additional staffing positions also within the Department of General Services focused on the delivery of capital projects. As DGS has seen more funding for projects like HVAC replacements, roof replacements, those sort of critical projects that are needed in order to extend the life of our buildings, they've realized that they don't have sufficient staffing within their capital projects group in order to ensure that those projects are delivered on time and on budget. And so this will help them to get have the capacity in order to hit those targets. So now that we've talked about the general fund, I'll share a couple of highlights about some of the other major funds in the operating budget. In terms of our utility budgets, this really makes up the water, wastewater, and stormwater funds in the Department of Public Works. Collectively, these budgets are up by about 7.5%, or about a $39.6 million increase year over year. Now, this budget is consistent with the rate increases that were previously approved by the Board of Estimates. That was 3 years of increases, where water and stormwater are up by about 3% and wastewater is up by 3.5%. This additional funding will help the utilities meet the staffing levels in order to operate the utilities, but will also allow them to continue to fund their debt service as they deliver their capital program focused on maintaining the overall assets of these utilities. When we look at the grant funds, as I mentioned, grant funds represent about 17% of our total budget. Most of those funds come from a variety of federal and state sources. We see the bulk of this living in departments like health, housing, and the mayoralty-related offices of homeless services, employment development, children and family success, and MONSE. One thing that I want to note is that we had agencies update their grant budgets post-release of the preliminary budget. So the amounts that are reflected here were the initial estimates that they had for these grants based off of their proposals that were submitted to my team in December. We have them update their grant budgets late in the process so that we get the best information possible, and where we really try to sync up the budgeted grant amounts with actual grant awards. So we will see these numbers change slightly in the final Board of Estimates recommendations that will be acted on in the coming weeks. And then finally, shifting gears to the capital budget. So as I mentioned, the capital budget is about $887.8 million. That's an increase of $95.3 million or 12%. One thing to note, when we look at pay-as-you-go capital, one of the ways that the city has really sought to increase its capital program above and beyond what we can afford from a debt service component is by utilizing general fund pay-as-you-go capital in order to step up our investment in capital projects. And so in fiscal 23, we were able to invest about $70.5 million from the general fund. Now, the bulk of that was coming from surplus revenue associated with the EMS ESPP program, where we received a payment in fiscal 22 that was unbudgeted. So we were using most of that $70 million is coming from that one-time infusion of funding that was intended to be invested in public safety facilities. So the $47.6 million that we're seeing in fiscal 24 really does, it includes sort of the base $20 million that we have consistently provided from the general fund, but then that also reflects the increased HUR revenue that we're seeing through our allocation next year. A couple of other things to note, the GEO borrowing amount is remaining the same at $80 million, and the budget reflects discontinuing the practice of utilizing county transportation bonds for transportation projects. Now that decision really coincides with the increase in HUR funding. The use of county transportation bonds was really was something that the city adopted after the HUR revenues declined back in 2010. And so now that we're seeing HUR revenue come back, we're stepping away from utilizing those that separate bonding authority. One thing I will note is that these amounts do not include the ARPA allocation that has been identified to put an additional $40 million towards capital projects out of the budget stabilization funds in ARPA. Those projects that will be that are assumed to utilize ARPA funds are outlined in the preliminary budget document, and that increased funding will allow us to make investments in things like ADA sidewalks, our street resurfacing program, the Northwest Community Action Center, and then various HVAC replacements at a couple of libraries. So when we look at how the capital budget changes year over year, this chart is showing us the general fund back sources that support the city's capital program. And again, you can see that these amounts change year over year based off of the availability of resources. Again, it's always been the city's practice that anytime there's unanticipated or one-time revenue that's identified on the operating side, that we try to invest that in capital, knowing that we have such a large deferred maintenance backlog that needs to be addressed by the program. So in terms of some major highlights within the capital budget program, as I mentioned, we are seeing the benefit of that higher HUR funding, and so DOT's total capital program is about $34.1 million when we look just at those general fund sources. The budget also continues to make investments in city school facilities. So there's $19 million for capital projects at schools, including $2.5 million for the construction of a new elementary school and $9.8 million for system replacements and renovations across the program. And then I just touched on some of the highlights from the ARPA program. So in closing, I just want to walk through some major dates that are coming up as it pertains to the next steps for the '24 budget. So this evening we'll have taxpayer night, where residents will have the opportunity to come in and provide feedback on these preliminary budget recommendations. The board will take action on the ordinance of estimates on May the 10th. The City Council will introduce the fiscal '24 ordinance of estimates on Monday, May the 15th. On Thursday, May the 25th, the City Council will hold their taxpayer night. Also that afternoon, my team will give a similar presentation to the council, really walking through the BOE recommendations. And then between May 30th and June 6th, there'll be budget hearings with city agencies and council chambers. And then the final budget, per the charter, must be adopted no later than Monday, June the 26th. So again, thank you for the opportunity to walk you through the recommendations in the preliminary budget. I'll take any questions that folks may have.
Thank you, Madam Director. At this time, questions from the board? At this time, I see the hand raised of Comptroller Henry. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Okay. Let me start with the tax revenue. I don't know if we want to go back and look at the individual slides. I can try to describe what the tax revenue slide showed a dramatic decline in filings by people who made less than $30,000 and less than $60,000 a year, and you referenced the increase in the people who are making more than $60,000 a year. Do we have a way to tell the difference between declines because people making less money left Baltimore and declines because people who were making less than $60,000 last year are now making more than $60,000?
Yeah, so overall, our income tax base is down by about 7,400 filers. In general. And like you said, we do see sort of the discrepancy between, or the differences between those income tax or the brackets. The data that we utilize to analyze this information comes from the state comptroller's office, and so we only have that information in the aggregate. So we aren't able to sort of follow tax filers to see if these changes are attributed to them moving up the income ladder, or if they're leaving the city. We can say that part of the overall decline is following some of the trends that we're seeing in population loss in the city. But what I can say as it pertains to this data is that it is of particular interest to me in order to study and to be able to come back with additional information to the board following adoption of the fiscal '24 budget, because we really want to break down and understand sort of more of the story behind what's happening in these numbers, to try to understand that while the overall tax base is up, if what we're seeing is that we're having higher levels of disparity in our community, that's obviously something we need to be aware of and to come up with strategies to mitigate. So that's something that we'll be working closely with our partners in the state comptroller's office to get more detailed data, so that we can try to understand what's happening with these demographic shifts.
Well, there's also been kind of, at this point I would call it a chronic narrative of people at the lowest end of the income spectrum sort of congregating in Baltimore, and the idea that if they're leaving Baltimore City, where are they going? I think that would be very important for us to know from a big picture perspective.
Yep, completely agree.
Okay. You started to touch on this in terms of BCPSS funding. and I'm trying to think if how to recreate my question at the moment. When you were saying it, it sounded like there was a roughly $129 million overall increase in funding for the public schools
For the past 2 years.
over
the past 2 years.
2 years.
Related to Kerwin.
And related to Kerwin, and this is kind of what I'm curious about, because it also, if memory serves, between last year and this year, the local contribution went up by more than $120 million.
That's right. So the 129 just represents. The
Oh,
city
that,
share.
okay, that was what I was trying to separate out,
Yeah.
is how much extra how much extra money from the state came leveraged by that $129 million from the city.
Yeah, so in fiscal 22, the state aid to Baltimore City Schools was $857.1 million. In fiscal 23, it was $1.1 billion. So the state share went up about the same level of the local share in fiscal 23. In fiscal 24, per the state funding formula, the state share would actually be coming down by about $30 million. But the governor included a specific provision in his budget to provide hold harmless funding for the school district so they wouldn't have to absorb that loss of state funding. So when you look at the state funding from 23 to 24, it's staying flat at about $1.1 billion.
Okay.
And
But the city contribution went up significantly.
that's right. So their budget, on the state share, their budget is staying at about $1.1 billion. Our local share is going from 313 to 392.6.
So I just want to reinforce, Kerwin was, I'm going to say, sold, partly on the idea that along with this dramatic increase in funding from the state, that would come with an increased commitment from the localities, which we all accepted. But this year, we kicked in even more money, and the state just held flat.
And the reason, go ahead, Council President.
It's important to look at it from a Kerwin perspective. The way the legislation was designed was not to put a huge blow on localities right away. There was an expectation that we were going to get a consistent increase if you go back to the chart. That was the projection. However, the state took its brunt earlier on the process. So when you look at, I think in the first year, the state increased close to $300 million, maybe $250 million. So it's hard to compare apples to oranges when you're looking at year over year and comparing the projection on the increase on the local level as relates to doing that same comparison on the state level, because the state level took its biggest brunt at the beginning.
Well, I appreciate the defense of the state.
No, it's no defense. I don't want to play semantics, but it's just the reality of the way the legislation was written.
Well, the reality I'm concerned with is that we were told that there would be a increase in funding from the state, Justine, in return for a big increase the first year from the city, and then modest increases for the next several years. And what in fact we've seen was a big increase from the state the first year, and a big increase the first year from the city, and then an even bigger increase the second year from the city. And I'm just concerned about, at this point, how do we trust future projections?
Yeah. I mean,
But Mr. President, Mr. Comptroller, what I'll say that, and thank you for your concern, and I'll say that concern that you have is shared by me, by my colleague in Prince George's County, and my colleagues in some other counties, and we have discussed that with the governor and his team, and they have committed to us to trying to work out any issues that have arisen like this has later on in the game. So I think now that we have a true partner in Annapolis that's in the executive level, we already had that at the legislative level, I think that we'll be able to try to work out issues to get back to what you're saying with the promise.
Okay.
And I think, you know, the big thing to keep in mind here is that these changes around particularly the education effort index, I don't think that people nobody thought that Baltimore City would fall out of that tier. And that was really what the unexpected shift was, because we went from, you know, that 100% credit down to 35. So I don't think that, I mean, we would not see like another $80 million, like all things stay the same. Like, let's say nothing changes with the formula. We wouldn't see a level of this change next year as well, because we've experienced the biggest drop that we could experience through the formula. So now it's how do we sustain it?
I'll try to take that as comfort. Okay.
Before you,
Mr. Mayor.
and I just, before you move on, I just think that I would be remiss if we didn't highlight this, that we are doing this because funding our schools at the level that they should be is the right thing to do, and that's what we're going to continue to do. We had to make tough decisions over the last few years. We're going to continue to have to make adjustments, but we will continue to meet our requirements and fund our schools, because imagine how different the city would be today if they did that when just the council president and I were in school, and I know that that's something you support. So this message is really for those who are watching.
And while we're on this topic, Mr. Comptroller, I guess the biggest change or the unexpected change in the formula was really going from farms to Medicaid enrollment. I guess the question is, are we under enrolling in Baltimore City? Is that a possibility in comparison to farms where it was somewhat automatic?
On that question, I don't know that I have the best answer at this point, but that's something we could follow up with our school partners.
Yeah, because I think just for the board's edification, I think that's the biggest thing for us to really research and try to identify. You know, if other jurisdictions are doing a better job of ensuring that Medicaid enrollment is there, that is more of a active enrollment process as opposed to a passive enrollment process. And I think that when we look at the formula and we look at the concerns of not being able to understand what that projection would be and the huge bump from a local perspective this year, that's probably the biggest variable in that equation for us to evaluate.
For sure. And we'll follow up on that.
Next question. We've been looking through the testimony that's been submitted in advance for tonight's Taxpayers Night, and there are a number of people calling for fully funding the Pratt. And I thought we should check in. Is the Enoch Pratt library funding consistent with prior years, or have we proposed cuts since fiscal 23?
The library budget is essentially flat from fiscal 23 adopted to the amounts that are reflected in the preliminary budget. The reason why it is flat is because as part of realizing some savings from the vacant positions, we did incorporate some level of assumed savings in the library's budget. But I will say that the library is one of the agencies where we've seen some of the highest turnover levels in the city. And so the library will be able to realize the savings target that is in their fiscal 24 budget without really changing any of their hiring practices.
But
just based
also
off of,
without improving any of their hiring practices.
Well, I had a wonderful discussion with the director of the library earlier this week where we laid out a plan within these numbers where we really think that we can focus on retaining some of our librarians, because that's been a very difficult classification for the library from both the perspective of retention and recruitment. So we are really focused on making sure that we retain as many of those employees as we can in terms of looking at what we can do on the compensation side, which again, we can accommodate within these numbers. The other thing that's happening with the library is that they're starting to negotiate with their union for the first time. There is, like throughout all of the positions in the city's budget, we did assume a pay increase for our employees in fiscal 24. So there is funding included in their budget for fiscal 24 in order to help them go into the union negotiation process as well. So I will say the library is fully funded to continue their current level of services. And my office is working really closely with the director to see how we reverse some of these trends that have been difficult with them from an operating perspective in terms of how turnover is impacting them.
So this may be a situation where the library is just an example of a more systemic situation. I know that in conversations with HR, our office has repeatedly felt we were on the same page with HR, that HR would like to be helping agencies hire faster, and for it to not take as long as it takes to onboard people. But if BBMR is projecting total salary expenditures on the basis of onboarding taking as long as it has taken, then you're either disincentivizing improving the process, or you're potentially creating an issue where people won't be able to hire their vacant positions.
Well, I would contend that the way that we factored in the vacancy savings for fiscal '24 actually gives managers throughout the city more flexibility in terms of how they manage towards these numbers. So we did not ask agencies to identify position numbers that they had to give up.
It's just in the aggregate.
Yes, exactly. And so, in terms of the adjustment in turnover savings that was assumed in the library, I think it equates to about 18 positions vacant throughout the fiscal year. The library is averaging between 60 to 70 vacancies currently over the last couple of years. So again, the library still has room to get above water and to hopefully reverse some of these trends within these numbers. So there's nothing that they'll have to do in terms of altering or changing their hiring practice in order to hit those numbers. Again, our hope is that, we're going to be continuing to look at ways that we can utilize different savings initiatives or revenue enhancements so that these increases in turnover savings are temporary, and so that we can look to rebaseline those as we go into the fiscal '25 budget.
Okay. You mentioned that the traffic camera revenue that was being discussed on the slide was exclusive of the speed cameras on 83, because those are broken out, and that money, it only goes specifically to doing repairs or improvements to 83 itself. Do we have an idea of how much money we're going to be able to budget for additional repairs and improvements to 83 out of the money raised through the 83 speed cameras?
Yeah, so the speed cameras on 83 went live last summer at the start of fiscal '23, and the actual number of citations that we're seeing from the cameras is quite a bit lower than what was initially projected as we were starting the program. We had projected that those cameras would result in about 595 citations a year. They're on track to generate about $320,000. So we're not dollars citations, 320,000 citations. So what that means is that the number of citations that we're seeing from the cameras is significantly less, meaning the revenue is less. Now, we are seeing driver patterns and behaviors on the I-83 corridor improve. Yeah. So I would say that means
that's a good thing.
The program is successful in helping us realize the outcome that we're hoping for. But what that means from having funding to invest in capital projects in the I-83 corridor is that based off of the revenue projections, we're really just going to be breaking even in terms of our costs to provide the program. We're not going to have additional funding available to invest in capital improvements through that source. So we'll have to look to other sources to support large-scale capital investment in the I-83 corridor.
Were any of the costs of that program front-loaded to the point where in future years the same amount of citations would result in more money available to actually do improvements?
So the costs here are primarily the cost of the contract for operating the cameras, and then staff time in DOT, who's responsible for managing the program, and then the staff time from the police department to review the citation, and then there's also some staff time from the Bureau of Revenue
So
Collections.
those are just constant costs.
Exactly.
Okay.
What I'll say is just like what we're seeing on the traffic camera citations, the collection rate on these is very low. It's under 50% as well.
Okay. And I think the last question I had was for the significant and greatly appreciated fleet increases.
Yes.
Do we have a rough idea of what percentage of those vehicles would be electric vehicles?
I don't have the exact percentage off the top of my head. Do you have? I don't. Yeah, we don't have it right off the top of our head,
But you can get that.
we can get that easily. We'll provide that to the board.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. Not a question, just kind of a statement going back to the speed camera discussion, Madam Director. I think that, and this board will remember, some of the concerns I expressed regarding the speed camera. I think that was a huge miss of entrepreneur opportunity for the city, knowing that that program is somewhat self-funded. When we look at the lowering of the projected amount of citations, but then also the amount that we have to pay out to our vendor that we're under contract with, I think is a huge opportunity. That was a miss that hopefully we maybe can correct when it runs out in the next 4 years or so that we have the contract. I think it's like $5.3 million or something like that, if I can kind of remember back to the numbers. Of that amount, how much is the expense, do you know, that we pay out to the contractor? Do you know? If you don't know off the top of your head,
I don't know off the top of my head. Are you talking just specifically about
the vendor that we went-
the ID3 vendor?
Yeah.
Okay, yep.
Because I think the year-to-date revenues is like 5.3
Yeah.
million.
Yep, but I can get that number for you.
Thank you. At this time, are there any additional questions or concerns from other members of the board? Hearing and seeing none. Ms. Comptroller, any additional questions? Sure.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Madam Director. Thanks again for the briefing. We understand we'll hear much more of the same information this evening at Taxpayers Night. We ask everyone to please tune in. For folks that would like to participate, please come out at 6 p.m. I see the hand raised of Mr. Comptroller.
Yes, I don't have a question, but I do have an announcement. Let me see if I can. If you have a white Toyota RAV4, license plate 16485CH, your car is parked out front in somebody else's spot. Please address that immediatly.
Or it
Thank
will
you.
be told.
All right, thank you everyone for coming out. Please remember Taxpayers Night is tonight at 6 p.m.